Tom Caughlan. I'm the tool lead for sanders for the San Diego Fine Woodworkers shop. And today we're going to talk about how to use a very, very important tool for woodworkers, and that's called the drum sander. We have two in the shop. We have one here that is called a 2550, and we have another that's called a 1632. And we're going to tell you in a little while what those numbers mean and why we call them that. Today we're going to talk about the sander itself, give you some introductory remarks, how they work. We're going to talk about safety precautions because that's really important in a member shop. And we're going to talk about basic operations and then perhaps some techniques and how they work. So we'll start. What's 2550 mean? Well, that means that the drum itself, and here's the drum, is 25 inches wide. And because it's open on one end, we can actually sand twice that width. So we call it a 25 for 25-inch width, or 50, which is the capacity. Now the second machine, the smaller one here, is 1632, and the same rules apply. 16 inches wide, and you can sand up to 32 inches wide. Now what do you use this for? Well, the basic use is for initial sanding of flat stock. So if you have a piece that you've already flattened and you've gone through the flattening process, but you now are about to go into assembly, you could start your sanding using the drum sander, and that'll take most of the milling marks out, and it'll also get it right down to precise thickness if that's important. You can also use it to flatten panels. If you have one side that's a little rough and one side that's already smooth, you can smooth it using this machine set. And of course, when you're doing cutting boards, it's all part of the cutting board process. Also very important if you're making doors or if you're making precise chests, and you have to have an exact thickness of a board, you can make this, you can use this machine to precisely mill the thickness of the workpiece so that it'll fit tightly into the joint. Perhaps you're making a guitar or another musical instrument and you're a luthier and you have to make that piece of wood exactly a certain thickness for the tone you want. You can do that using this machine. Go to other online sources. They'll take you through a graduated step to start with maybe an 80 grit belt, and they will take you down through maybe 150. On the shop here, we use a standard 80 grit rather than moving into the finer grits on the belt, and because we think that's really important. And frankly, a lot of people use the machine and it takes a while to change the belts out. So it'll always be a standard cut here. So when you start sanding, when you finish the work, you'll start using your random oscillating sander, start with an 80 grit bit, 80 grit pad, and work down from there. So let's talk a little bit about the parts. You have a dust cover. This is the dust cover on both machines. You open it right there. Here's the sanding belt and the sanding drum. The sanding belt wraps around and it's clipped in place by clips on either end. The top of the drum is shrouded by the dust cover, and then the dust cover is connected to the vacuum system. When you turn the machine on, you always want to have the blast gate open so that the vacuum in fact works. You put out a lot of dust with this, and you want to make sure you collect it all with the vacuum. Next thing we're going to talk about is the conveyor. The conveyor belt is right here. It's a sanding belt, an elastic sanding belt of about 100 grit, and it's intended to move your workpiece under the drum. It's controlled by this switch right here. So this is called the conveyor switch. And down below here is the drum on-off switch. The conveyor switch has a control that allows you to advance the conveyor at a certain speed. Normally you would use a high speed for rough cut and a slow speed for fine cut. But since we always run 80 grit on this machine, we want to run it through at 100%. Now, why do we want to do that? Because there's a system in here called IntelliSand, which senses the load placed on the motor that drives the drum. And if the motor bogs down because we're taking too deep a cut, IntelliSand will slow down the belt so that we don't ruin the machine overheat the motor or do other damage. So you want to have it set for 100 so that it has 100% of its potential advancing in order to slow it down. Otherwise, it won't have that much range of safety. We set the depth of cut with this control right here. One turn is a 1/16 of an inch. Now, we don't use a full turn. We use an 1/8 of a turn. Why just an 1/8 of a turn? Because number one, you can't put back what you've sanded off, but more importantly, it's good for the safety of the machine and the conservation of the belts. So we turn it this way is down and ensure that you're only using an 1/8 of a turn for both safety and for the quality of your work. Before we start this up, let's talk a little bit about safety. Number one, you've all read the shop manual because you've passed a test before the shop supervisors let you come to work. Always wear eye protection. And that's important because little bits of dust can get back in your eye. You always want to feed the stock in the direction of the belt, and that is against the turn of the machine, just like any other woodworking machine. You always want to make sure you keep your fingers out from underneath the belt. You never want to put fingers in there when this machine is plugged in, much less on. You always want to make sure the dust cover is closed when you're operating. And just like any other machine, you want to keep hands, clothing, long hair, jewelry away from the drum. Now, when you feed stock into the machine, you want to keep your hands above the stock and behind it. And also, you want to make sure that as you start to feed, you don't have anything underneath it, because the pressure here is going to force that stock down tight. And it'll give you a pretty nice little blood blister if you're not careful. A couple of other cautions, and you only want to put raw, unfinished wood through the sander. Now you can see here, I've glued up this piece that would be a cutting board, and one of the great concerns we have is putting glue through the sander. Why? Because these sanders create a lot of heat, and they take the glue and they melt it, and then they run it right back into the belt, and what will happen is it'll burn onto the belt, and then the next time a piece of wood goes through there, it'll burn your stock. And now you've got a real problem. First, the belt has to be replaced. That's about 10 bucks a pop. But more importantly, your work will be scarred and you'll have to deal with that scarring. So always scrape the glue off before you put any piece of stock through the machine. If it's ever been finished before, make sure you've gotten rid of all that finish, because the heat generated by the sanding disc will strip that finish off and put it on the belt. And by the time you're done putting your work piece through, it's going to be burning your wood. So you want to make sure that only clean, new raw stock goes through there. Now let's talk about how to actually use the machine. We've got a piece of wood here that's a glued up cutting board, raw edges, never been through the sander, and we're going to try and make it into a little better looking finished product before we go through some trimming. We've measured the thickness of the cut, the board here, and then we've used the indexer here so that we have a depth of cut that is above the thickness of the board. So if we ran this through right now, even if we turn the machine on, we won't have any action because the sander won't be touching. So we need to figure out, where do we start? What's the start process? So to do that, we have the drum cranked up a couple of turns thicker than the board is. We open up the dust cover, look inside, and you can see the roller turns free. And now we're going to feed in the workpiece until the roller stops. We don't have there's no power on the roller, only the conveyor. And we turn it, and then we lower it. And you can see it's turning, and now we know where to start. So with that set, we now have our depth of cut, and I eyeball where the handle is, because I'm going to use an 1/8 of a turn on this handle every time I put the board through the machine. So it's going to start here at what I'd call the 6 o'clock position, 12 being up here like the hands of a clock. We're going to start the conveyor, and we're going to start the vacuum to make sure this works. glass gate is open and the sander is on. Hands behind, and you can hear it make its first pass. Eighth of a turn. Repeat. And you can see that even with an eighth of a turn, the sound of the machine tells you it's making a significant cut. Eighth of a turn. Hands behind. One more time. Eighth of a turn. Hands behind. Now, without making a change, let's turn it over. And you can hear that it's still making a significant cut. Eighth of a turn. Now, all these adjustments have equaled 1/2 of one turn, or a 32nd of an inch. Yeah, let's see what we got. Thank you. Okay, so you can see that we flattened this board out, and we've taken it a long way to being a good start on finish sanding for a cutting board made out of birch end pieces. And we did it with end grain, and that's one of the great attributes of the drum sander that you couldn't use the planer for. Is you can trim down the end grain, sand it smooth, whereas the planer might chew it up. It's also true of quirky sort of grains like burl or maybe curly maple. So with that, that's the drum sander, a very, very useful tool. Since we sanded this to 80 grit, when I take it over to the sanding table and start using the random orbital sanders on it, I'm going to start with an 80 grit disc, and then work through the grits down to get it as smooth as it needs to be. Certainly, probably down to 220 or even finer. So with that, that's the drum sander. Thanks very much.